Welcome to this deep dive. We're going to get into a topic that I think a lot of people find fascinating and even a little bit spooky.
Definitely a little spooky.
Yeah.
For sure.
Today we are talking about witch trials.
Mhm.
And we're asking the question, did they ever really end?
Ooh.
Yeah, we're going to unpack a lot here. We've got some amazing sources that you provided. We've got this book, Witchcraft, A History in 13 Trials by Marian Gibson. We've got this piece from the Times of India about the Salem Witch Trials.
Mm-hmm.
And we've got this article from Popular Mechanics that kind of explores an unexpected link between witch hunts and the printing press.
Yeah. I think one of the things that's so interesting about this topic is most people, when you say witch trials, they think
Salem.
Salem, yeah.
Right.
But what if I told you that Salem is just like one tiny piece of a much bigger, much darker story?
Okay, see, now I'm interested. So
Yeah.
you're saying we're going beyond just the typical imagery of Salem. We're looking at a much wider phenomenon here.
Exactly. Gibson, in her book, she really emphasizes that Salem might be the most well-known example. But these trials were taking place all across the world and for centuries. England, France, the U.S., even Basutoland, which is present-day Lesotho. And we're talking a time period spanning from the 1600s to, like, modern times.
Wow. Modern times.
Yeah.
Okay, this is already making me feel a little unsettled. So this is making me wonder, like, what even defines a witch?
Mm.
You know, I feel like that's a word that gets tossed around a lot, but the meaning has probably changed a lot over time.
Oh, absolutely. The definition of a witch, it's incredibly fluid, and it's always been deeply, deeply political. Gibson highlights how, especially during the Reformation, the definition of a witch really shifted. What might have once been seen as traditional healing or folk magic, during the Reformation, all of a sudden it was like demonized as heresy.
So it was less about what they were actually doing and more about who had the power and who was challenging that power.
Precisely.
Okay.
And this is where the printing press comes in. Remember that Popular Mechanics article you sent me? They talk about how Johannes Gutenberg, he's the inventor of the printing press. Well, he kind of unintentionally fueled this witch hunt craze.
That is wild to think about. It really makes you realize how even advancements, technological advancements, can have some crazy unintended consequences.
They really can.
So what was it about the printing press that caused this? I mean, was there a specific book or something?
They do talk about a specific book. It's called the Malleus Maleficarum, which essentially was like a witch hunting manual. And this became a bestseller thanks to the printing press. And it laid out this very specific, dangerous theory of witchcraft that included things like how to identify witches, how to interrogate them, how to punish them.
So this one book, made popular because of the printing press, kind of helped spread a very particular view of witchcraft across Europe, shaping people's beliefs and actions.
Yes.
That is powerful.
It's powerful, and it's pretty terrifying when you think about it.
Absolutely. And this spread of misinformation really created a climate where accusations could easily take root and spread like wildfire.
Yeah. This is making me think about the Salem Witch Trials and the Times of India article you shared. They talk about how the trials started with these young women, these girls, who were exhibiting really strange behaviors, like they were having convulsions, fits, things like that. And that led to these accusations of witchcraft. And it's interesting because if some of the accusations were based on people trying to gain power or property or something like that, you know, how did people convince others that what was happening was actually witchcraft? I mean, were they just taking advantage of these existing fears in the community? So it's actually like a really complex interplay of different factors. You've got the Malleus Maleficarum, which we talked about, which provided this framework for understanding these behaviors, these really strange behaviors, as demonic influence. You've got existing anxieties and fears about the unknown. You've got religious fervor and a lack of scientific understanding. It's like all of these things kind of come together and create this perfect storm for mass hysteria.
So it wasn't just about taking advantage of people's existing fears. It was also about shaping and amplifying those fears, giving them a name, giving them a face, the witch.
Exactly.
Okay. So now we're getting into some really dark territory. And I think it's important to remember that certain groups were much more vulnerable to these accusations than others. And Gibson, in her book, really spends a lot of time exploring this, how marginalized communities, particularly women, people with disabilities, the poor, enslaved people, how they became easy targets for accusations of witchcraft.
It's so sad.
It is. And it really makes me think about what we were just talking about with the printing press. In a way, both the accusations and the printing press, they were tools that were used to amplify existing power imbalances and prejudices, leading to some really tragic consequences for the people who are already the most vulnerable.
Absolutely. It's a stark reminder that even advancements, technological advancements, can be used for really harmful purposes to serve ideologies and agendas that are ultimately harmful to people.
It's a sobering thought. And
Wow.
Gibson uses this really powerful example in her book. She talks about the case of Elizabeth Clark in 17th century England.
Yeah.
She was a single mother. She had a disability. She was already struggling just to survive on the fringes of society.
Yeah.
So she was essentially the perfect scapegoat.
And the Salem trials, like that Times of India article points out, that also saw a similar pattern of targeting these marginalized communities. So, for example, they talk about these touch tests. And what they would do in these touch tests is they would poke and prod the accused to see if they could feel pain.
Oh.
The idea being that a witch wouldn't react to pain. It's a really chilling example of how easily reason and due process can kind of go out the window when fear takes over.
It's really disturbing to think about, like these touch tests. The fact that this was considered legitimate evidence
Yeah.
in a court of law, it's mind-boggling.
It speaks to this profound lack of understanding of the human body and this willingness to believe the most like outlandish accusations without any real evidence.
Right. This makes me wonder if we've really learned from these really dark chapters in our history. I mean, have we?
I think that's a question we're still grappling with.
Yeah, so this is all incredibly insightful. But I'm also curious, if these witch trials were happening all over the place, were there any common threads?
hmm
Were there things that kind of fueled these hunts, regardless of location?
That's a really great question, and it's one that Gibson really digs into in her book. She argues that while the specific triggers for these witch hunts, they might have varied. It could have been a sudden illness, it could have been a crop failure, it could have been political upheaval. There were always these underlying anxieties, societal pressures that made communities really ripe for these kinds of accusations.
So we have these underlying anxieties. We have the spread of misinformation through things like the Malleus Maleficarum, and we've got these vulnerable communities being targeted. This all sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It does.
But what about the accusers? I mean, what was their motivation? What made them point the finger at others?
I think that's where things get really complicated because in some cases, some people genuinely believe that they were witnessing witchcraft. But in many other cases, the motivations were a lot darker. Think about personal grudges, envy, a desire for social status, or even just trying to deflect suspicion from themselves.
So it wasn't always about genuine belief in the supernatural. It could just as easily be about human pettiness, greed, or even fear.
Unfortunately, yeah. Especially in the context of a witch hunt, an accusation, that could be like a weapon that's used to settle scores, to seize property, or just to eliminate rivals.
And once an accusation was made, it seems like it was almost impossible to prove your innocence. The Times of India article, they mention another test that they used in Salem called the swimming test.
Yes, the swimming test. So what they would do is they would bind the accused hand and foot, they would throw them in the water. If they sank, they were considered innocent because the water, it accepted them. But if they floated, well, that meant they were a witch because the water had rejected them.
That's crazy. I mean, there's no winning in that
No,
scenario.
it was completely arbitrary. It's based on this really absurd logic that water would somehow reject a witch.
I think sometimes people might overuse the witch hunt metaphor. I mean, some situations today are fundamentally different, right?
Yeah, that's a really important point. And while the term witch hunt gets used a lot to describe, any type of persecution or scapegoating, it is important to be mindful of that historical context. Not every instance of injustice, of social pressure, is a direct parallel to these really systematic, often state-sanctioned witch trials of the past. But we do see echoes of these events in the way certain groups are still marginalized, demonized, denied basic rights.
So it's a complex issue, and one that really requires us to think carefully and be nuanced.
For sure.
We can't just throw around the term witch hunt, but at the same time, we can't ignore the ways in which those patterns of fear, scapegoating, persecution, how they persist in different forms.
I agree.
Okay, so we're starting to see how this deep dive is about so much more than just spooky stories.
Yeah.
It's about power, it's about prejudice, it's about the human capacity for both incredible cruelty and resilience. But before we move into the modern world, I want to talk about one more figure from the past, and that's Tituba, or as Gibson refers to her in her book, Tatabe.
Yes. Tatabe. It's subtle, but it's a really important choice. It's this emphasis on her humanity. And that's something that often gets lost in the historical accounts. She was an enslaved indigenous woman, likely from present-day Venezuela, and caught up in the Salem witch trials. And her story's particularly tragic because she was one of the first to be accused. And her confession, it was probably coerced, but it really added fuel to the fire of this whole witch hunt.
So she became a pawn in this much bigger game of fear and power, her otherness, her race, where she came from, her status as an enslaved person. All of that made her an easy target for suspicion and fear. And even after she was released from prison, we don't really know what happened to her. She just disappears from the historical record.
That's so sad. And that's actually a recurring theme in a lot of the stories of people who were accused of witchcraft. They were often silenced,
Yeah.
erased from history, their voices just completely lost to this dominant narrative.
It's almost like being accused of witchcraft was a kind of social death.
Yeah.
Even if they escaped physical harm, their reputations were tarnished, their communities turned against them, and their stories just weren't told.
And this is where art can be really powerful. So the Times of India article, they mention an engraving of Tatabe, and it depicts her in this grotesque, almost monstrous form. It's a reminder of how prejudice can shape our perceptions and how it can demonize anyone who's seen as other.
It's also a testament to just how enduring the power of images can be.
Yeah.
Because even centuries later, that engraving is still influencing how people view Tatabe and her role in the Salem trials. But what if we could use art to kind of challenge those harmful narratives?
Yeah.
To reclaim the humanity of the people who were silenced?
That's such a fascinating idea. I mean, art can be such a powerful tool for social commentary, for challenging the dominant narratives, for giving a voice to those who have been marginalized. I mean, imagine like an art exhibition that reimagines Tatabe's story, not through that lens of fear and prejudice, but through the lens of empathy and understanding.
That's an image I would love to see.
Yeah.
But for now, let's shift our focus to the modern world. If witch trials were more than just a blip in history, and if they've left behind echoes that we still see today, then where might those echoes be? What forms do they take in our world? That's a question we're going to explore the next part of this deep dive.
I'm excited to get into that.
So we left off talking about Tatabe and those silenced voices. And, it's a reminder of how easily people can get swept up in these mass hysterias, how it's usually the most vulnerable who suffer the worst consequences. It makes you wonder, are there parallels between those historical witch hunts and the way marginalized groups are treated today? Those patterns of fear and scapegoating, they seem to keep topping up throughout history.
It is a sobering thought, isn't it? Even for centuries of quote-unquote progress, we still see those echoes, those dark chapters kind of playing out, just in different forms. Gibson argues that the witch trials never really ended. They just morphed. They've adapted to the changing social and political landscapes.
So if we accept that they adapted, where might we see those echoes in our own time?
Well, I think we see it in a lot of places. The rise of conspiracy theories, the spread of misinformation online, the demonization of immigrants and refugees, the persecution of minority groups based on these unfounded fears. I think all of these things, they share that same thread, that same common thread as the witch trials, this targeting of outsiders, using fear and paranoia to control people and dissent, the erosion of due process, the belief that there are unseen forces that are driving misfortune. These were all tools that were used to justify the witch hunts back then, and they're still being used today, just in more, subtle, insidious ways.
So it's not just about overt persecution or violence. It's also about these more subtle forms of marginalization and silencing that can happen.
Exactly. It's about seeing those patterns, the way power can be misused to create these divisions, to scapegoat those who are different, and how easily fear can be weaponized to justify discrimination and erode our basic rights.
This makes me think about cancel culture and how that plays out online. I mean, is that a form of modern-day witch hunting? The speed and ferocity with which accusations spread online, often without any evidence or due process, it feels eerily similar to those historical witch hunts, right?
That's a really astute observation. I think the digital age has created this new landscape for witch hunting where accusations can go viral instantly, reputations ruined with a single tweet, individuals subjected to this relentless online harassment with no real recourse. It's a chilling reminder of how easily the tools of communication can be used to amplify fear and hatred and prejudice.
And it feels like we're all vulnerable in this digital landscape. Anyone could be targeted, anyone could be accused, and the consequences, they can be devastating.
Absolutely. The digital world has blurred the lines between public and private. It's created this climate where individuals can be held accountable for every word they say, every action, in ways that just weren't possible just a few decades ago. And while this can be good in some ways, it also creates these opportunities for abuse, for mob justice, that kind of mass hysteria that we saw in the witch trials.
So what can we do? How do we navigate this complex digital landscape without falling prey to the same patterns of fear and scapegoating that have been around for centuries?
I think it starts with awareness. We need to be critical of the information that we're consuming online, question assumptions, demand evidence before rushing to judgment. Remember that everyone is entitled to due process, even in the court of public opinion, and we need to stand up for those who are being unjustly targeted, even if we don't agree with them or their views.
That sounds like a tall order, especially in a world where information travels so fast and emotions so often override reason.
It is a challenge, it's a big one, but I think it's one that we have to rise to. The stakes are just too high to ignore the ways in which history is repeating itself. If we don't learn from those past mistakes, we're just going to keep repeating them.
So we need to be more discerning, more critical, more aware of the ways in which we're being influenced online. What about those more systemic issues we talked about? The ways in which power can be misused to silence and control. What can we do about those?
I think that's where our role as active citizens comes in. We can't just sit back and hope that someone else will fix those problems. We need to engage in the political process, advocate for policies that promote justice and equality, hold our leaders accountable, demand transparency and accountability from those in positions of power. And we have to be willing to challenge those who abuse that authority.
So it's about voting. It's about contacting our representatives. It's about supporting those organizations that are fighting for social change. It's about being the change we want to see in the world.
Precisely. It's about understanding that democracy is not a spectator sport. It requires active participation. It requires critical engagement. It requires a willingness to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard, even when it's difficult.
That's a powerful message. And I think that's something that everyone listening needs to really take to heart. I'm also thinking about the role of education here. If we can teach future generations about the dangers of fear-mongering, of prejudice, about the erosion of due process, maybe we can stop history from repeating itself. Maybe we can break those cycles of violence and scapegoating that have been around for so long.
You've hit the nail on the head. Education is absolutely crucial. It's about equipping individuals with those critical thinking skills they need to identify these harmful patterns, to challenge them. It's about teaching them to question their assumptions, to seek evidence, to empathize with people who are different from them. It's about fostering a generation that's informed, engaged, and empowered to create a more just and compassionate world.
And maybe those small acts of courage, multiplied across millions of individuals, can start to tip the scales. We've talked a lot about the potential pitfalls of the digital age, but I wonder if technology could also be part of the solution. The Popular Mechanics article talked about how the printing press kind of helped spread that witch hunt craze, but could we use the power of social media for good?
That's an excellent question, and one that I think offers a lot of hope. While social media can definitely be used to amplify fear and prejudice, it can also be an incredibly powerful tool for connection, for education, for activism. We've seen countless examples of social movements using platforms like Twitter and Facebook to organize protests, to raise awareness about injustice, to challenge those oppressive systems. It's all about harnessing the power of these platforms to connect with like-minded people, to share information, to share resources, and to build solidarity across geographic boundaries.
So it's not about shutting down social media or censoring certain viewpoints. It's about being more discerning, more critical, more aware of how we're being influenced, and using those same platforms to amplify voices that are often silenced, to challenge those harmful narratives, to promote understanding and empathy.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that technology is a tool, and like any tool, it can be used for good or bad. It's really up to us as individuals and as a society to decide how we want to use that power.
This has been a really eye-opening conversation. We've explored the historical context of witch trials, looked at their modern-day echoes, and talked about how technology plays a role in perpetuating these harmful patterns. We've also talked about how media literacy, critical thinking, empathy, and being active citizens are so important in combating these forces. I think it's time to shift our focus to solutions. How can we actively resist these forces and create a more informed, equitable, and compassionate world?
Okay, so we've covered so much in this deep dive. I mean, from the history of witch trials to like their echoes today, it's been a lot.
Now I'm ready to kind of shift gears a bit and focus on solutions.
Okay.
We know the problem.
Sure.
So, like, what can we actually do to combat these echoes of witch trials in our own time? What can we do to fight back?
Well, I'm glad you asked because, knowledge without action is kind of like a seed that hasn't been planted.
Mm-hmm.
It has all this potential, but it's not really going to flourish, right?
Right.
So let's start with something we've already kind of touched on, and that's media literacy. In a world that's just overflowing with information, and a lot of it's bad information, it's so important to develop those skills.
Yeah.
To be able to navigate this landscape critically. It's like having a shield, right, against manipulation and all the dark arts.
That makes sense. But what does media literacy actually look like in real life?
Okay, so imagine you see this shocking headline.
Okay.
Or a really provocative picture online. Before you share that, ask yourself a few questions. Who created this? What's their agenda? What evidence are they showing? Is there another side to this story?
So it's about pausing, taking a breath, and really engaging with our critical thinking skills. Before we accidentally contribute to spreading something harmful, it's like putting on the brakes before you cause a pileup.
Yes, exactly. It's about thinking like a detective, not like a gossip.
Right.
Check the source. Look for evidence that supports it. And just be wary of anything that seems, too sensational or designed to get you really emotional. If it smells like a trap, it probably is.
That connects back to what we were saying before about how fear played such a huge role in those witch trials.
Right.
So if we can learn to spot those tactics, like those appeals to our deepest fears and anxieties, then we're less likely to be tricked, to be manipulated.
Fear is powerful. It can cloud our judgment so fast. It's like a fog descending,
Yeah.
So if you see something and it triggers a really strong emotional response, especially fear or anger, stop.
Yeah, okay.
Ask yourself, is this fear, is it justified? Or is someone trying to use it to control me?
This feels especially relevant with social media. I mean, the algorithms, they prioritize content that gets us riled up. It's like they're designed to exploit our emotions, to get us hooked.
It's true. But, we have a choice. We have the power to choose what we click on, what we share, how we react.
Yeah.
We can be the masters of our own emotions. We don't have to be slaves to an algorithm.
I love that. Master of our own emotions. That's going on a t-shirt.
Yeah, there you go.
All right. So we've got media literacy. We've got critical thinking. These are some key tools. What else can we add to our witch hunting toolkit?
Well, another powerful antidote to fear and prejudice is empathy.
Oh, okay.
Remember Tatabe?
Mm-hmm.
She was more than just a name in a history book. She was a real person with her own hopes and dreams, her own fears, and her story and all the others like it. They remind us that there's a human cost to these witch hunts. They're not just abstract.
Yeah, it's easy to forget sometimes that we're not just dealing with ideas or debates. We're dealing with real people's lives.
Right.
Real communities, real suffering.
Exactly. So the next time you read a story, maybe it's about a group that's being targeted or demonized. Just pause for a second.
Okay.
Try to imagine what it would be like to be them, to be seen as the other, to be seen as a threat just because of who you are or what you believe.
It's about shifting our perspective.
Yeah.
From us versus them to just we.
Yeah.
Recognizing that we're all human, we're all vulnerable.
Exactly. We're all in this together. And the more empathy and understanding we can bring to the world, the less likely we are to fall for those same divisive tactics that fueled the witch trials.
I like that. I'm feeling a bit more, hopeful.
Yeah.
Like we're not just helpless victims, doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past. But what about those bigger systemic issues we talked about?
Yeah.
The ways in which power can be used to silence people, to control them. What can we do about those?
I think that's where our responsibility comes in. As engaged citizens, we can't just sit around and hope that someone else will fight those battles for us. We need to be active. We need to engage in the political process. We need to support those policies that promote justice and equality, and we need to hold our leaders accountable for what they do.
So voting, contacting our representatives, supporting organizations that are fighting for change, being the change we want to see.
Yeah. It's about recognizing that we're not just passengers on the ship, we're part of the crew. We have a responsibility to steer it in the right direction.
Okay, I'm with you. I'm also thinking about education and how if we teach future generations about the dangers of, fear-mongering, of prejudice, of the erosion of due process, maybe, just maybe, we can break these cycles of scapegoating that have been going on for centuries.
I think you're absolutely right. Education is like it's like that silver bullet,
Yeah.
or the enchanted sword that can fight the demons of ignorance and prejudice. It's about giving young minds the tools of critical thinking, empathy, historical awareness. It's about giving them the power to be the guardians of justice and the champions of compassion.
Wow, that's a powerful image. So we've covered so much, from the history of witch trials to how those patterns are showing up today. We've seen how fear and power and prejudice, they create such a toxic brew, but we've also talked about solutions. Media literacy, thinking critically, having empathy, being engaged citizens. These are our weapons. This is how we fight back.
And remember, this is just the start of your journey. The quest for knowledge and justice, it never really ends.
Mhm.
So, we've given you the map. But now it's up to you to chart your own course. Keep exploring these ideas. Keep asking those tough questions. And become an active participant in creating that better future.
I love that. So to wrap up this deep dive, we'll leave you with one final thought to ponder. If the printing press kind of fueled those witch hunts back in the day,
Mhm.
is social media the modern-day equivalent?
Ooh, good question.
Think about how information and misinformation spreads so easily today. Could we be participating in new forms of witch hunts without even realizing it?
It's definitely something to think about.
The answer to that question is within each of us.
Yeah.
So keep asking questions, keep challenging those assumptions, and keep fighting for a world where everyone feels safe, valued, and empowered.
Yes. Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this journey. And remember, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.